When my partner threatened to call the cops, Mom repeated that song. Then came the Facebook posts, indirect rants about ungrateful people and how shocking it is that some kids can turn on their parents so easily. Aaron somehow got involved while on honeymoon and called Lydia to scold her for being mean to her mom, but like I said, Lydia is mad. Lydia is angry and she's had enough. Whatever she said to Aaron stopped her from calling the rest of us. Then there was a Facebook post about how much it hurts to be kept from a grandchild. My mom's sister called me and there was yelling, even calling my fiancé the word. I blocked the number. I know Dad tried to convince our mom to just leave us alone. He kept apologizing because she just wouldn't listen to him. Aaron came home after 2 weeks. She tried to reach out to Lydia again, asking for all of us to talk because obviously we all have some issues to work out. We didn't show up. Aaron was very angry about this because she is not used to us not showing up for her now while our mom was on a rampage. Our dad was still trying to be better with us and he has improved a lot. He and I went out for dinner, just the two of us, had a drink, and he apologized. It wasn't a generic apology that he could have repeated to all of us about how sorry he was for hurting us and neglecting us, but he brought up specific instances that he wanted to apologize for. I know he did the same for the others, but having him apologize for things like canceling a fishing trip because Aaron needed him was something I didn't expect, and I never really cared for fishing, but I wanted to go on that trip. I wanted my dad to prove that I was a priority to him somewhere deep down inside. It didn't happen and I never asked again, but we went fishing a few days later after he apologized. When my siblings expressed interest in going fishing, first my brothers, then Nadia, and even Lydia, who hates the smell of fish, Dad brought the youngest, Lexi, and I brought my son, and it was great. It was one of the best days of my life. I suck at fishing, but I'm pretty good at collecting seashells. It was brilliant. Our parents did it. We ended up arguing when Dad went home. The argument was mostly because Mom didn't understand why we were still in contact with him and not her. She found it insulting that we were repairing our relationship with him. She was angry that Dad didn't push us to forgive her or why he didn't stop us from acting out. She was angry that he didn't extend an invitation to her and run an errand for her. Mom started giving us the silent treatment a few months later, and my dad moved out of her house after a month of that. And while we were getting the silent treatment, Dad was bearing the brunt of her anger. And it really took it out of him. He was trying to do better by us and she was trying to demonize us, and he finally told her that if she didn't take responsibility for her actions soon, then he was going to get a lawyer. Mom didn't take him seriously, and he's been staying in Lydia's guest room ever since. Mom doubled down and said that he was blind for not seeing how we were manipulating him. Seeing how we manipulated him, unlike the rest of us, Dad apparently still has regular contact with Aaron, and according to him, she's even told Mom to rethink what she's doing. Not surprisingly, Aaron's involvement is what got Mom to back down. I'm not sure if she's thinking about how she treated us, or if she's quietly stewing in my narcissism. My parents told my golden child brother that he could take my house and I could just live in a camper because I'm single and he has a wife and kids. I'm a single man in my early 30s and my brother is 29 with 4 kids. His wife and I don't get along because she always likes to try to get a rise out of me by acting superior and then turning into an extreme self-sacrificing drama queen. Victimizing drama queen. If I get back at her in any way, she can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking. I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any kind of job even though she has a college degree, and my mom volunteers to help with the kids all day, so their finances are completely dependent on my brother. This also means that they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Growing up, my younger brother was also the obvious favorite. He developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I retaliated against his antics in any way back then. it was obvious my parents cared about him a lot more. My brother was physically abusive to me on a number of occasions, flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point that she broke up with me, and laughed at every misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. To keep up appearances, I have to admit it was pretty funny to see the looks on their faces when they had to treat me the same as my brother on birthdays and Christmas because there were other people there. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossip and drama, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on and threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school yet when I moved out. I hadn't even finished high school when I moved out, but couch surfing was a lot better than living with them. I had little contact with them since I left home. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I didn't really care from that point on. I only saw my parents and brother on holidays like the rest of them. And brother on holidays like the rest of the family. Then I ended up losing my job and couldn't afford my condo. I had to sell almost all my stuff because I was going to be homeless soon if I didn't downsize to an extreme, but I had a plan. I own a truck, so I found a $1,000 camper in good condition and put it on my truck just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living out of it a lot longer than I ever thought I was originally hoping to be able to live out of the camper at my parents' house where my brother and his family still live as well. But when I asked my parents to let me stay for a while, they said no. But when I asked my brother and his family to let me stay for a while, they said yes, they would let me stay for a while. My parents to let me stay for a while. They told me they had a full house and didn't want me there unless I paid them exactly what it would cost to rent an apartment in the area, which was way too much just to park my camper. My parents called my camper and my sister and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. My sister-in-law thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her in pointing at me and mocking me while calling me a homeless bum. I parked my truck SL camper in a store parking lot to sleep the first night. Finding a stable place to park was pretty difficult and I had to deal with a bunch of things, everything from beggars to drug addicts. When I finally got a new job after months of searching, I was practically living in the back lot of the building next to the warehouse, an old employee parking lot. My boss, the owner of the SL company, actually liked this arrangement because I was willing to take any shift I could get as long as I got enough sleep. I was pretty much on call almost all the time when they needed me, and worked virtually every day of the week. I made a lot of overtime pay and hands-on learning some new skills from other employees. Eventually, midway through that year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor. Midway through that year, I landed a better position with the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than my old job. That's when I decided I wanted a house. The fear I had of losing my condo made me realize I needed something much more stable for the long term. I looked around for something close to where I worked, and just 2 miles away I found a 3-bedroom hand-built home on a small lot. Bedroom handmade home on a small lot that I was able to get for $10,000. Less than the asking price. I used almost all my savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough room for me to back my truck in behind the house to take the camper off and set it up in the backyard. When I was fully settled into the house, I was stupid enough to brag about it in my book of faces. My family saw the post, and this is where it really starts. After a few weeks, my parents and brother along with his family came to visit completely unannounced to see me and my brother and my sister and my brother's family, and I was so happy to be able to live in the house and have a nice place to call home and have a nice time. I didn't even give them my address, so how did they find out where I live? I still don't know. None of my friends have confessed and no previous family members have visited me before, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home. It really wouldn't surprise me. As soon as I opened the door they practically all pushed their way in like overzealous tourists, then they just started making themselves at home. They all kept poking around. And my sister-in-law had this creepy grin that she kept flashing at me. And it wasn't until later that I figured out why. It made me madder than a bull on steroids that just got stung by a hornet. My parents kept talking about how I had so much extra space now, and it was too much for someone like me who didn't have a wife or kids. Sure, not now, but maybe someday. My brother kept remarking about how there was more space than our parents' house and my house. Closer to his job too, red flags all around, I know. Finally my brother asked me to talk to him privately. Everyone else suddenly left the room and poured out onto the porch. That's what finally made me realize they were planning something. My brother Dan said the house was too much for me alone, so I should let him move in with his family because his wife is pregnant with kid Ash 4. He pointed out that I already have the camper, so I could just live in it. He also started talking about how there would be changes and even curfews, that I couldn't just walk in at any time without notice. If it wasn't my brother, I think the person I was talking to had lost their mind, but Dan lost his mind a long time ago thanks to our parents treating him like he was the center of the world. I tried to speak, but he kept talking over me. As if I had no say in the matter. There was no way in hell I would rent my house or parts of my house to him, other people maybe, just to help me pay the mortgage, but certainly not him or his nasty wife. I've heard about this kind of situation many times in videos on the internet, and never once did I think I would actually live it, because I thought it was so ridiculous. But my parents, brother and sister, by Dan, didn't even seem to care or notice that I had done it, and just sat there with his arms waving around while he talked about all the reasons why he needed my house, and then went from saying that to acting like it was a done deal and trying to reach out his hand to shake mine. And that's when I finally showed some backbone and said hell no. I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled over himself. I said it loud enough that Dan stumbled backwards. For a second I had rarely raised my voice to him to that level because I was punished by our parents whenever I did, but this was my house, not theirs. My spine can be as shiny as it wants here. I told him that my house was not up for grabs, and acting like I was going to let him move in just because they want him to is not going to make it happen. I bought my house for me, and it is not my fault that he keeps having more kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to live with our parents. Dan got as close to me physically as he could without actually touching me and said that I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family to live. I laughed in his face and said that was total BS because I worked hard to be able to buy my house. Of course I deserve it. Dan started yelling that I don't have a wife or kids and I don't need all the space, so I might as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything. And he never even offered to pay for it. I said I'm not giving him anything, and he didn't even offer to pay me rent. If I let him move in I would still be paying the entire mortgage on my own house without even being able to live in my own house. Then Dan told me that he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first, and our parents said I will and I will. I yelled like their word was law or something and told Dan that they didn't have the right or the power to give him my house. Then right cue my parents and sister-in-law burst back in through the door. My parents and sister-in-law burst back in through the front door and surrounded me and tried to force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up, from that point on I heard the line, "Just do it for Dan," more times than I can remember in the fin. I told them all they had no say in my life or my house and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed the loudest at me about how she was pregnant again and I can't do this to her. I said I didn't do anything to her. She just assumed she could take from me like I would just allow it. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up bitch who never had any respect for me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. I have no sympathy for her. She won't be living in my house. Well, that made her angry enough to attack me. She She got in one good punch to my face and tried to do more, but my brother held her back, kicking and screaming. She kept telling him to let her go so she could scratch my eyes out. The phone I was holding was recording pretty much everything, so I held it up and said I was going to call the police if they didn't leave right away. My parents told Dan they were leaving. Then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't and not to come back. I told my sister-in-law that my phone was recording everything and she was going to call the police if she didn't leave right away. I told my sister-in-law that my phone was recording everything and if she tried anything I would press charges for assault. She yelled at me and then stormed out loud, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and said that I better do this for Dan and my sister-in-law. I responded by telling her that I wasn't going to be there after I kicked my parents, brother and sister-in-law out for trying to force me to come back. I told her that I was not going to be there after I kicked my parents, brother and sister-in-law for trying to force me to give my new house to my brother. I immediately went on my social media and told the whole family the story. I posted about it because I knew the first thing my family would do when they got home is try to twist the event to make me the villain, and they did try to do that, but it was too late. Everyone already believed me. The week went by and my parents showed up with Dan on my front porch just like they said they would in their previous ultimatum. They rang my doorbell and told me they were going to leave. They rang my doorbell like crazy and banged on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack and they tried to force their way in again, but I had installed a couple of deadbolt chains that prevented it and even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I said I was recording the whole thing on camera and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother came in. I told them to go away and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me why can't I just do this for Dan because he is my beloved brother. I laughed and then bluntly said I do not love him as a brother because he has treated me horribly for years and they have only encouraged him to do so. They are horrible parents and he has a horrible brother. Then told him to go away where I would be. I called the police as soon as possible, and they all left surprisingly easily. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday night to find a moving van and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. It was Dan and his family moving their stuff and he just waved at me with a poop-eating grin. When I saw him I was furious and told his family to stop, but his sister-in-law smugly told me that I was crazy and that I was going to have to stop because she was going to have a baby. In-law smugly told me that like it or not they were moving, and then in the most fake way while tilting her head and puckered her lips she said that it was okay because my mommy said it was okay and I should always listen to what my mommy tells me. I was seething with rage just hearing those words and looking at her smug, beachy face, so I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, sister-in-law started pounding on my door. My sister-in-law started banging on my window and yelling at me to stop and that I couldn't do this to her because her family needed the house more than I did. She cried, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded with, "F, Dan, it's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck if I didn't stop calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told my sister-in-law if she damaged my truck, I'd kill her. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck I would sue her, and she was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan's entire family had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened and showed them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. When we went to my front door I saw that they had changed the lock and the old lock was lying on the porch with the center of it drilled out. The drill they used was right next to it. Could they have done that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill and then gave the police a rundown of all the events that had happened before. Well, I guess Dan called our parents over at some point after I got home because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that was an easily provable lie one way or another. So Dan and sister-in-law finally came out of my house with me. Law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they had somehow outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was one, but it didn't look like my handwriting. I told my parents and Dan that this was stupid, blatant fraud. And if the cops were to investigate, they would easily find out, and I don't think going to court would do them any good. It could even cause Dan to lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen or broken, and I would call CPS too. For good measure, Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all this, but my mother came between us and doubled down on how I should just do this for Dan and live in a trailer so they could finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, she could do it for Dan herself. Instead, the cops separated my mother from me and I said I want them all out now or I will press charges. I explained in a screaming fit how they drilled out my front door lock to break in. The lease papers were obviously forged, they badly forged my signature, and I have a taped video of my sister-in-law attacking me. In-law attacking me. These are crimes I could F their lives with if I wanted to, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I'm doing. The only reason I hadn't already was for the sake of Dan's kids, so they have a chance to get the F out. The moment my parents heard this, I think it finally clicked that they couldn't force me to do this for Dan. My mom surrendered and said she was going to put an end to this. Then she went over to sister-in-law and talked to her quietly for a minute while my dad talked to Dan. My sister-in-law immediately started crying loudly and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny pieces and throwing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the pieces of paper or he would cite them for littering. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying and the oldest was sobbing that he wasn't going to get his own room now. Sister-in-law and Dan gather their kids up in the moving truck. Law and Dan gather their kids together to try and make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with a sad family routine, you know, where they all gather together in some kind of group hug while everyone is facing one direction. I swear I think they practiced it beforehand. All the kids have the same pleading look with quivering mouths. Sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant body. In-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy, and my brother just made the saddest face he could and said, "Please don't do this, we need to be able to live here," but I didn't blame her and told them to keep packing. All the kids and sister-in-law turned the crying up to 11 when they were done. Law turned the crying up to 11 and Dan yelled at me, "Are you happy with yourself? You have denied us a home because you are too selfish to share and help your family." I ended up laughing like a maniac and retorted that what he was trying to do was take, not share, and no amount of crying will make me let his family move in because he is not my brother anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks he can take whatever he wants from me. Like when we were kids, Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool it or he'd be in cuss. Regardless of whether I wanted to press charges, he sucked his lips and looked a mix of scared and extremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stay until my parents, brother and sister, in. Luckily, they said they had no intention of going anywhere until this was resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 cops became 4 as more drove up for whatever reason, which gave my parents an extra incentive to leave. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he put on my front door, even though I got a new lock the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to give them to me. Then instead of giving them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain, saying he was going to go get them himself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull down the steps just to get to them, and he got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back he just grumbled, then slammed them into my hand. I told them all to leave and never come back, and my mom said that I would be disowned for this like it was some kind of threat to me, and I said that to them, and then in an overly sarcastic way I said, "Oh no, that means I won't be able to come on any vacations with you guys where I always get treated horribly by you guys anyway because Dan was always your obvious favorite and you all treated me so badly when I was growing up." That if Dan ever needed an organ donor I wouldn't give him anything, so do what you always told me to do when I was being mistreated by all of you and suck it up. My parents were devastated after I said all that, and a quartet of cops looked at them pretty judgmental as well. My mom started crying and walked away. My dad just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me. Dan just held his kids in defeat, and sister-in-law was off having a tantrum on my front lawn. Soon enough they all formed a line, handing out boxes and getting their stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was all taken out pretty quickly, but while they were doing it my mom kept saying it wasn't too late and I could still do it for Dan. Several times each time she tried to bargain more and more to make me change my mind. She said Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I don't want Dan or his family around. I don't want his money, and I certainly don't want to live with him or my parents ever again after the way they treated me when I was a kid. Making a deal with my parents would be like making a deal with the devil for me. Sister-in-law ended up throwing another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down and then sat on the floor and had a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat there looking angry / sat there until everyone else was done. They finally got everything out of the house and into the truck, so before they left, I talked to my parents one last time about all the things they did to me. I told my parents one last time about all the things they put me through growing up with 4 cops right there. They couldn't do anything but stand there and take it for once. I even pointed out how they couldn't just do something nice for me like let me stay in my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet, how they let Dan and sister-in, well, who's the bum now? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could stay in it for free, yet when I needed a place to stay, they wanted to charge me more than I could afford just to park my camper. When they knew I was out of work, I asked them what did I ever do besides being born to deserve to be treated so badly. Because when I finally have a little success in life they want to take it away from me for their favorite child because they would rather I give everything to Dan and have nothing for myself. I bought my house with the money I earned. I owe them nothing and I will never ask for anything from them again because clearly I will never be anything more than a daddy or a cash cow in their eyes. I got no, they just stood there looking like fish out of water, so I continued to rant and ask them what in God's name made them think they were such good parents. After all of this my father was blushing but more with embarrassment than anger. This time my mother was crying that she was a horrible person. I bluntly agreed that she was a horrible person, but if I had called her out on all of this and in private instead of in person I would have been able to tell her that she was a horrible person. They just kept up the denial for so long that it became a part of who they are. Dan and his family avoided me completely. As they finished putting everything back in the moving truck I made sure nothing of mine was stolen before they left. They all got back in their vehicles and sister-in once they were all gone and I went back online and spilled the beans about what had happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try to defend their actions this time, no matter how much my sister-in-law tried. My parents tried before that. We did it for Dan line. No one listened anymore. By this time I offered to host half the family at my new house next Christmas Eve. My parents were not invited. Surprisingly I wasn't blocked by my brother and sister, and I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because my sister-in-law was making passive-aggressive posts. I'm sure it's driving my parents up the wall because they're not getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 loud kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a new sister-in-law. Maybe they could move into a trailer in their own backyard and let Dan take over their house completely, then they might get some peace. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. My golden child brother stole my Taylor Swift tickets that I was saving up to buy a new laptop, so I sold it on eBay and kept the money. I've heard relatives talk about how disappointed they were in me, but how happy they were when their second child was a boy. They never bought me any toys I wanted or asked for, but had a room full of stuff meant for boys. They bought him a phone when he was 14, but I had to work to buy my own. And buy my own because they didn't trust me. Hell, they literally sent us to different schools so they wouldn't have to pay a higher tuition for me. Unfortunately my brother picked up their habits and thought I was meant to be treated badly. He would constantly get me in trouble by telling lies about my behavior. When I was 8 he broke the TV in our house by literally throwing a baseball at it. I tried to tell my parents that I was playing with a doll in my room and that I had never touched a baseball in my life, but they didn't believe me and I was sent to bed hungry because they said that troublemakers didn't get dinner in this house again when I was 14. I really wanted to go to a boy's birthday party because I liked him and I already had permission from my parents, but my brother told them that I was already seeing someone and the party was just a ruse to meet him. He went to a different school and had no idea who the guy was, but my parents still believed him and grounded me. I was really depressed when this happened because I thought the whole school was going to die. I was really depressed when that happened because I thought the whole school would hate me for not showing up even though I was invited, but luckily they were really understanding and didn't blame me. Plus I actually started dating the guy. I started shoveling snow off our neighbors' lawns and cutting their grass to save money for a phone. My parents demanded that I do the same for our lawn, and that they didn't want to pay me because it was my obligation. I listened to them because being grounded was time wasted in my bedroom and I didn't want that. Luckily I was able to buy a smartphone when I turned 17. My parents never even bothered to exchange numbers with me, but by that point I had stopped caring. They sometimes said that a girl didn't deserve her own phone because she couldn't be trusted, which sounded ridiculous in my head anyway since I bought it on my own, so they couldn't really do anything about it. I'm a really big fan of Taylor Swift and it's my dream to go see her in concert. A while back I saw that she was going to be performing near my town, so I started saving up money to buy tickets. I had gotten a new job at a high-end fast food restaurant and I was getting paid by the hour, so I started taking on more shifts, but it wasn't enough. The sale date for the tickets was coming up and I hadn't saved enough money. If it was the following week I would get paid again and would have the needed amount, but it wasn't, and if I couldn't buy them on the first day then I knew the tickets would double in price. My boyfriend, the same guy whose birthday party I couldn't go to, knew how much I wanted to go and he told me he would be happy to give me the remaining amount and I was able to buy a ticket in the amount of I was able to buy a ticket in time. I was really excited to go because he also bought one for himself so we would be there together, but I made a terrible mistake by talking about it at home. A few days later I came home from work to find that my concert ticket was missing. I looked all over the house and even under my bed, but I just couldn't find it, so I decided to check the teddy bear camera that I had bought for my room, knowing that I had put my ticket in a place where the camera could see it. To my absolute shock, my brother had just walked into my room and taken it like he owned it. I immediately confronted him about it and of course he denied it, but I showed him the evidence on my phone. He tried to grab it out of my hand so he could delete the footage, but I have faster reflexes and avoided it. I told him he needed to give it back to me or I would report him. He just started laughing and said, "Are you crazy? I already sold it because Taylor Swift concert tickets are selling for a fortune right now." Then he pointed to his new laptop and said that he had spent the money on the Taylor Swift concert tickets. I ran to my parents and told them about it, but they brushed it off like it was nothing. "If your brother took it, then what's the problem? A laptop is much more useful than a concert ticket anyway, so technically he prevented you from wasting your money." I knew my family always treated me badly, but I never thought they would go this far. They knew how much I liked Taylor Swift and how much it meant to me, but none of them cared. Since I had it on video, I could probably report my boyfriend to the police. and he would get arrested, but then my parents would just bail him out and it would end there. In my head I had just wasted the money my boyfriend gave me and I felt terrible about doing this to him, so I decided I would make my brother pay. I waited for him to go out with his friends and snuck into his room. I took his laptop along with a box and charger since it was brand new, and in case he also had a camera I posed with a pi sign. I immediately Googled the price and it was surprisingly more than my single ticket cost. I put it up on eBay and low-balled it by $150, so I got an offer on literally the same day. Within hours his new laptop was gone and I was holding the money in my hand. I went over to my friend's house and explained the situation. He said he didn't care about the money and was just sad That I didn't get the chance, so he gave me his ticket. I thanked him a lot and also told him to keep all the money as well as the ticket for now because my brother might try to take it by force When I got home my brother was already yelling and telling my parents that I had stolen his laptop. He had no evidence, but of course they believed him and told me to give it back immediately. I denied the accusation, but they called me a thief and threatened to call the police, so I said okay, let's call the police. I actually have evidence of my brother stealing, so he is the first one they will arrest. How do you think that arrest will look on his upcoming college applications? Update: when I got home my brother was already yelling and telling my parents that I had stolen his laptop. How do you think it will look on his upcoming college applications? I denied the accusation, but they called me a thief and threatened to call the police, so I said okay, let's call the police. I actually have proof of my brother's theft, so he's the first one they'll arrest. How do you think this arrest will look on his upcoming college applications? Everyone got really quiet except for my brother, who started calling me names like useless, ungrateful, and even the B word, but my parents for the first time got really quiet. But my parents told him to shut up for the first time ever. They knew his chances of getting into a prestigious college were over. The second I reported him for stealing, they just told me to go to my room and that I was grounded for my rude behavior, but for the first time in my life I didn't care. I had fought back against my family and actually won. I was so happy I jumped on the bed and danced like a maniac. They saw how happy I was and decided to stop making food for me. They also refused to let me cook because apparently the food and utensils belonged to them. I had no money with me, so I went back to my boyfriend's house the next day. My parents tried to stop me, but I told them that I was going to buy some food. When I got to my destination, I was greeted with a pleasant surprise. My boyfriend's parents welcomed me with open arms and said that they had cooked for me because their son had already done it. I'm actually turning 18 in a few months, and my boyfriend asked me to move in with him in the new apartment he's buying. I don't think anyone has ever said yes as often as I have. I told them that I wished I was born into their family and that I hated mine, but they didn't judge me and said that I was going to be their family anyway, which made me and my boyfriend blush. So yeah, I have to go back. I've been discriminated against my whole life because of my golden child sister. She tried to walk down the aisle at my wedding and I finally got my revenge. Ever since I can remember, my parents loved my sister more and treated her like a golden child. They didn't even try to be subtle about it, because every time I accused her of stealing my clothes, they wouldn't believe me, but if she said I took her toilet paper, I would be grounded. Even if there was undeniable proof, they would still give her a lesser punishment, and my birthday cake had to be the flavor she wanted, and my parents always denied, knowing that I didn't like that kind of cake. Our family vacations were always to the places she wanted, even if it was an event that was supposed to be about me. My sister grew up spoiled and didn't like me. My parents loved to brag about her accomplishments but never mention any problems, whereas with me they loved to bring out any flaws of M constantly as teasing material. In high school she and I had no friends. Wasn't surprised that my parents had spoiled her, which made her too introverted to talk to anyone. While I was quite popular, she found this unacceptable by lying to my parents that all my friends were drug addicts, and I was forbidden to be friends with everyone, which saved me from complete isolation. My extended family, most of my family lived in the same hometown and I got along with my cousins despite some age differences. At one gathering they invited me over and I told them how I was forbidden to leave the house. When asked why, my unfiltered child self replied that it was because I wasn't allowed to have friends since my sister didn't have any. My parents found out pretty quickly and had a huge fight with our extended family, and as expected I was grounded for complaining. Eventually my sister's situation got worse, so she changed schools. I guess the humiliation of the extended family knowing her social status was bad and she demanded to be moved. My parents immediately agreed, even though it cost them more since the school was further away. My sister made friends at the new school. I thought this would make her ease up on me, but instead it made it worse. Her friends would come over and bully me, and my parents called it like teasing. I never had friends over because my parents were horrible hosts, or my sister would accuse them of stealing stuff and they would believe it, but I did get close to my cousins, especially because my parents didn't dare mess with them, and I slowly started to believe that life was back to normal. Especially because I finally got a boyfriend. But little did I know that my sister had her ways of ruining that as well. I didn't want to bring him home at all, but when my parents found out, they insisted that we arrive at my doorstep, and from the moment he walked in, my sister had been staring at him. At one point, we were separated. And he came to find me to tell me that my sister was flirting with him. He said that she came over with revealing clothes and batted her eyelashes badly and started telling him how bad I was and how good she was at intimacy. He told me that he didn't want to listen to any more of it and came to find me. I told him that he should leave and that I should leave. I told him to leave and that I was going to confront her about it. When I confronted her about it in front of my parents, my sister told them a different story, that my boyfriend had instead tried to flirt with her, but she of course refused since she would never do that to me. I forgot how favored my sister was, and of course they sided with her. No offense to her, but she had the same body as my parents, who were overweight. I knew for sure that my boyfriend would not try to cheat on my model body with my sister's. We tried to keep our relationship a secret, but we couldn't because my boyfriend wanted to be touchy once in a while. I ended up dating another guy, but history repeated itself and the same story happened. My new boyfriend was so traumatized by the experience that he broke up with me. Thanks to my sister, I became the high school SLT and failed to get into any new relationships. The tide turned once in her life. My sister brought her first boyfriend. After 2 hours of boring stories about my sister, I could tell that my sister's boyfriend was excited to leave. As soon as he left, my parents turned to me and asked why I couldn't be like my sister and find someone like her. Their relationship lasted 3 days because the poor guy couldn't carry that much weight on his shoulders, both physically and metaphorically. Years went by and things stayed the same. I was confident that this was the worst that could happen, but little did I know my parents and sisters had worse in store for me. Part 2. My sister finally graduated from high school, and you would think she was more mature for college, but she was still the same. She got accepted to college but had no scholarship that could ease the financial burden. Her grades in school were poor from then on. Whenever she got an A, which was once in a lifetime, we would all celebrate. My parents would invite all our families just to celebrate. My parents of course made a lot of fanfare and told her they would pay for everything. I thought her going to college was the best thing that could happen to me, but it turned out to be the worst thing that could happen to me. Eventually my mother came to talk to me about my upcoming high school graduation and told me that since they were paying for my sister's college, they had no money to pay for mine, so it would be better for me to start working right after graduation and wait for my sister to graduate. After graduation and waiting for my sister to finish college to see if they could afford anything for me, which basically meant that I would either go to college with student loans or take 4 years off and live in their house where they also made me pay rent. It was obvious that she was trying to get me to throw a tantrum because she didn't like my simple answer, so I told her that I was fine with not going to college and that I never wanted to go in the first place, which was a complete lie, but I figured I could use her words against her. My dad later tried to get on my mom's bad side, but he also failed after a lifetime of bad parenting. A few years went by and I worked very hard and got a scholarship, not somewhere like the Ivy League, but it was a good enough course with a full scholarship. Knowing that my sister would hate it and try to stop me, I put my achievement on social media. At the same time I told them, I even forced myself to thank them in the post. Now they couldn't stop me from going as they have to explain to the family why not. I guess my sister finally got to them and they changed gears and asked me if I was sure I wanted to go. They told me how my sister was not doing well in college, and since she was smoking they told me that she was not doing well. Well, in college, and since she was smarter and had better judgment than me, I would suffer worse. I lied to them and told them that my classes were easier and that I would be fine. They weren't happy with my decision but couldn't stop me. College ended up being my savior, and for once in my life I was happy. I still kept in touch my parents and visited them on holidays and such, but since they refused to pay for anything during that time, I avoided introducing them to anyone, and I'm glad I did, because that man ended up becoming my husband. Unfortunately for my family, my husband was the type of guy who loved drama. He won't forgive or forget, and he's probably cooking up some revenge. Most people thought he was an angry man, but he was the sweetest man if you treated him with respect. When we discussed marriage, we decided we didn't care about the ceremony. Because of our budget, we would rather spend it on our honeymoon, so we sent out the engagement announcement and the save the day. A few months later, my parents had no idea and naturally demanded to meet my husband. Well, my husband looked like I had cancelled Christmas when I told him I would at least make sure they were never alone with him. He had been preparing for this because he knew what to wait for. He even bought a high-quality recorder that he could hide in a pocket to record it all. He was excited thinking of all the people he would be able to meet. He would be able to tell them everything. 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 I was excited thinking of all the ways he could reject my sister's advances, insult her, and then spread the recording of her attempts to my family. I refused to go with him, so he went alone and was excited to meet them. When he came back an hour later, he had the most euphoric look on his face. Before I could say anything, I was confused and wanted to listen to the recording, but he told me it was better to listen to him first or else I would misunderstand him. As I listened to his story, I realized I had made the best decision of my life by choosing this man as my husband. My husband was the best thing that had happened to me, and I was happy that there was someone who would finally stand up for me. He went over to my parents' house to meet them, and when he came back he told me how many chances we had to F them over. I asked him to tell me what he meant, and he told me that it was the best decision I had ever made in my life. I asked him to tell me what he meant, and he began to tell me what had happened. My parents weren't necessarily happy with my husband because of his aggressive character, but they said that we were willing to pay for my wedding on one condition: my sister would be the first one to walk down the aisle at my wedding, and in a wedding dress. My husband asked why, and they said that it wasn't okay for a younger sister to get married first, so it was only fair that my sister at least have the experience of it. My husband told me how he recorded the whole conversation with a grin on his face. He didn't try to say no to my parents because he was planning revenge. My husband told me how this was a perfect opportunity for revenge, and it helped me get out of a horrible headspace. We had a blast thinking of ways to screw them over. We then called his much more level-headed brother when we decided on a plan. My husband's brother scolded us for this idea, calling it unethical and a terrible thing to do, so instead we decided to invite my parents and hire security and not let them in. We also came up with the best plan to get my parents to pay for the most expensive wedding we could get. My husband went back to my parents and said he was sorry he hadn't told them about the wedding, and said he was sorry he hadn't told them about the wedding. My husband went back to my parents and said that he was willing to accept their offer, even though I would not like it. He pointed out that I do not like conflict, so if I was surprised by it, I might not throw a tantrum in front of all the people. Once this was agreed upon, my husband brought up the subject of money, telling them that if they paid for the wedding, I would feel even more pressure to keep quiet. Once my husband and my father shook hands, I saw my grown sister jumping with joy in the video. For any discussion about my sister walking down the aisle in front of me, he would go over to their house to talk, and so began the months of deception. My parents and sister thought they were tricking me, and my husband and I were milking them. We decided that my husband and sister would go over. We decided that my husband and sister would go over the food and decoration options, and every time my husband would point out the cheapest option available, he would then sigh and say, "It's too bad, we don't want to abuse my parents' goodwill, so we wouldn't get the best options." My sister thought she was going to be a big part of our wedding, so she demanded that my parents pay for the best. My parents would then tell my husband not to worry and they would pay for the most expensive option. During this whole process my sister tried to flirt with my husband because she was under the illusion that she was marrying my husband. My husband acted conflicted and made sure to keep a safe distance from her. My husband told me that he enjoyed the whole trickery more than planning our actual wedding. A few days had passed and it was finally our wedding day. My husband and I were more excited about tricking my parents than the wedding itself, but I never imagined that things would go better than expected. Part 4 Our wedding was planned to perfection and our revenge awaited us. Perfection and our revenge were waiting to be executed. My husband and family had come up with what they thought was a perfect plan. They wanted my sister to arrive at the perfect time to walk down the aisle so she would avoid talking to me. My husband and I made sure to keep our security hidden at first. When the guests and my parents arrived, all they could see was a woman with a list of names to check only after my parents arrived and my parents were gone. A few minutes later my parents got a text from my sister saying that my sister was 5 minutes away. My dad stood up and made some gestures with his head and soon my bridesmaids followed him down the aisle. A friend of mine who was in on the plan texted me and told me to get ready. As soon as my dad took his position the bridal song started playing. The doors opened and I walked in. My dad looked shocked when he realized it was me instead of their golden child. He tried to look at the entrance of the venue to see my sister. He was supposed to walk me down the aisle but he didn't. He got a phone call from someone and used it as an excuse to leave and mumbled something came up. There was gasps and confusion all around. The friend in on it loudly asked what happened. I lied in a teary voice, said he told me I wasn't supposed to be there. My husband's father quickly ran over and took my arm. I walked down the aisle whispering as people discussed what had happened. My husband and I deserved an Oscar for how well we cried. Fake tears. My parents never came back and they don't miss my marriage. No one dared tell me what had happened, but one did tell me. He whispered in my ear that he had to go to the bathroom or he would burst out laughing. Our plan had worked. I was told that my sister arrived in a wedding dress. The security refused to let her in until my father went there and tried to threaten him with the police, claiming he had never heard of him. The security had no problem with the police coming because he was hired to do it. My dad realized by then it was too late and tried to demand that he let my sister in. My dad went after my husband and he pretended to be confused. He denied ever agreeing to anything so ridiculous with my parents in front of everyone. When they insisted he did, he demanded proof and of course they couldn't find any. My sister was screaming, crying, and apparently sitting on the floor kicking her legs like a child. My dad looked like he was hitting my husband, but security and other people held him back. The venue had cameras but they refused to show me the footage of my dad hitting my husband, but some people took videos and even uploaded them online to watch my parents and sister being torn apart by anyone and everyone. Who the drama was delicious. After years and years of being accused of things and not being able to watch them have a taste was one of the best wedding gifts. My mom was crying, my dad kept changing from purple to white, and my sister was still on the floor crying and screaming. They kept insisting that my husband was in on it, but people kept asking why would my husband agree? Why was there no proof and why did they want my sister to do this to my wedding? They were told to leave and had no choice but to do so. My dad apparently had to drag my sister away as she refused to leave the floor. Their taxi arrived and before my dad got out he said, "You are going to pay me back every penny." We were glad he was gone and we all went back to enjoying our marriage.